Hey folks, today we're going to look at all those Zelda stories, whether they're games, comics, books, whatever, that are always overlooked. You know the ones I'm talking about. The Zelda animated series, the comics, the mangas, all that good stuff. We're even going to include the spin-off games that are always overlooked, like the Tingle games, and yes, even Link's Crossbow training. We're going to figure out where those go in the Zelda timeline, and we're going to create a big, unified Zelda timeline for you to enjoy. So, let's do this. Okay, so what I've done here is I've basically recreated the Zelda timeline as you see it in Hyrule Historia and the Zelda Encyclopedia. So right here, this is just all the traditional Zelda games you know about. Skyward Sword, Four Swords Adventures, Ocarina of Time, you know, just all of these. As most of you know, after we get up to the game Ocarina of Time, the events of that game cause a split in the timeline, and you get 3 timelines branching off of that. I mean, there's lots of debate about how this timeline exactly works, but I'm not going to get into that here today. Instead, I'm just going to assume that the timeline as presented in the Hyrule Historia and the Encyclopedia is correct, and we're just rolling with it. So I've just basically recreated that over here. The way this works is basically these yellow lines are obviously the timeline themselves, and these boxes, each box is kind of like an era. Like, for example, this one is the era of light and dark. Now, this basically means that, you know, you see, for example, in this era, you see 4 games. This indicates that all these 4 games are roughly in the same era as each other. As you know, in the Zelda series, there are lots of different incarnations of Link and Zelda. The games take place over many thousands of years, and they, you know, Link and Zelda die, and then they're reborn. Each box represents, you know, basically roughly the life of one Link and Zelda. So if you see these games are in a different box, this means they're centuries or even thousands of years later, and they feature a different Link and Zelda than these. And down here we've got all the various Zelda expanded universe games, comics, mangas, books, etc., and so on and so forth. We're gonna take these stories and we're gonna, you know, one by one, we're gonna sort them and figure out where they go. So let's start with this one. This one, we call this the Skyward Sword prequel comic. It doesn't really have much of a title. Now, this comic was published with Hyrule Historia. It is a prequel to Zelda Skyward Sword, so at first you might think it would go in the same box as Skyward Sword, but actually it turns out this Link that we see here is not actually the same Link as the Link we see in Skyward Sword. This takes place centuries earlier, before Skyloft was raised up from the ground, which is the backstory of Skyward Sword. So this is a completely different Link. This is centuries earlier. The Link in Skyward Sword thinks of him as a hero of legend, which is sort of mentioned in the game. There's some debate as to whether the hero of legend in Skyward Sword is actually Link when he travels back in time in that game. So that's not a settled question, but at least according to this comic story, this is a completely separate Link. He's depicted with a totally different personality and a totally different history, and this manga story is the backstory of that. So this guy gets his very own box. He's not part of the Skyward Sword box. He is before that, in the era of the goddess Hylia, before the Sky era. So our timeline's looking pretty good. It's starting to come together. It's looking a little bit more complete, I would say. Next up, we've got this comic, Hyrule Under Fire, which is German for Hyrule Under Fire. It is a comic produced in a German-only Club Nintendo magazine, I believe. And this is sort of a prequel story to Zelda Ocarina of Time. It tells the story of how Link's mother first brought Link to Hyrule, and so this is the very same Link as we see in Ocarina of Time. It's just when he was a baby, and it is quite a tragic story. You should check that story out. But that clearly goes in the same box as Ocarina of Time, in the era of the Hero of Time. And next we have another book that seems related to Ocarina of Time. This one is called Nintendo Heroes, Link and the Portal of Doom. Now this book is just a little quick adventure. It's not a major story. This is just another adventure that Link has where a random portal appears in Hyrule and he has to deal with it. Now from the clues you get in the game, you can sort of figure out that this does take place during Ocarina of Time, because the backstory to this book, it mentions that Link had agreed to help Zelda save Hyrule, and there's indications that Link is trying to help Zelda save Hyrule, so that would place this during Ocarina of Time, during the child era, before he even grows up. So I'm just going to put this, let's make it a bit smaller, and I'm just going to put this to the right of Ocarina of Time, because it takes place basically at the same time as Ocarina of Time. Now here's where things are going to get a little bit spicy. The Tingle games. This first game is called Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land. Now, where exactly does Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land take place? It is a little bit weird, and because Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, it hasn't even been released in America, it's Japan and Europe only. There isn't a whole lot of discussion online about when it takes place. The game is also sort of vague about when and where it takes place. It takes place in new areas called First Continent, Second Continent, we don't know where they are. The one clue that we do get, all right, the one clue is that Tingle starts out as a 35-year-old man, all right, and he's 35-year-old man, and he is not yet Tingle. So this is Tingle's origin story. Now that's a clue right there, because here in Majora's Mask, we see that Tingle is still a 35-year-old man, but he's already Tingle. So this probably somehow, I mean, it's sort of hard to reconcile with Majora's Mask, but if you take that at face value, Tingle is 35 and he becomes Tingle, and that would put this before Majora's Mask. So we can't be exactly certain about exactly when Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land takes place, but it's a year. It's the same year as Majora's Mask. So that does put it probably either during the same time as Ocarina of Time or shortly thereafter, because, Majora's Mask takes place not long after the child era of Ocarina of Time. So I think it's reasonable to put Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land right here. So I think I'll put it to the right of Nintendo Heroes, Link, and the Portal of Doom, but we'll put it before the timeline split, because it makes sense that, this is the origin story of Tingle, but we've seen Tingle in multiple timelines here, right? We've seen Tingle appear in the Wind Waker, or at least some version of Tingle. Whether it's the same guy or not it doesn't matter. He's in some way descended from or, inspired by this Tingle, so it makes sense for this Tingle's origin story to have happened. Tingle also appears in the Oracle games, I believe, and he appears in Four Swords Adventure. So he appears in all three timelines. So it does make sense to put Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land before the timeline split. Okay, and we can see that the era of the Hero of Time is just really getting fleshed out. Before there's just only two games, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, for this one Link. But now this whole era is opening up, so we're learning so much more about this era by looking at these games that we've added in. Let's keep going. Next up, we've got Color Changing Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. This game is even harder to play. It is completely Japan only. They didn't even make a European release in English. There are fan translations available online, but that's a whole other story. So this game is kind of a weird Tingle and the Wizard of Oz crossover, so that's interesting. It's pretty cool. However, for our purposes today, when does this game take place? There aren't that many clues in the game itself. When you first start out playing this game, it's just a 35-year-old man named Tingle. So, okay, 35 years old, but is it the same guy? Is it the same Tingle? At first, playing it, I thought there weren't really many clues. It seems like it's a fresh start for Tingle. However, there is one clue that this is the same Tingle we see in Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, which is that his dog, Barkle, which he gets during the events of the first game, is still his friend at the beginning of Color Changing Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, Color Changing Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. And so, for that reason, I think it's fair to say this takes place after Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, which means I think this might even take place after Majora's Mask, but it would have to be in the child timeline, because if it's after Majora's Mask, then, you know, that's where it would have to go. Once again, Tingle is still 35 at the time of this game, so this can't take place very long after Majora's Mask. It has to be around the same time. Like, these games have to be happening in short succession. Freshly Picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, then Majora's Mask, then Color Changing Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. Now, Tingle's balloon fight is... there are basically, you know, from what I would can tell. Now, I haven't actually played this game. I have played the other Tingle games, but this one I have not been able to play. Unfortunately, it is Japan only as well. From my detective work online, the only thing I could find out is that Tingle's balloon fight basically has no story, not much at all. So I'm left basically guessing. It could take place in any timeline. It could take place in any era. We've seen Tingle throughout the ages in all three timelines, so we really just do not know. So I'm just gonna take a guess, and you know, I will come back and update this timeline if any of my guesses are proven wrong. You know, I can always make another video and, you know, fix it, make updates to the timeline, add new things in, and fix mistakes like this. But for the time being, I'm gonna make a guess, and my guess is gonna be that this takes place in the adult timeline. You know what? In fact, I'll even put it in the era of the Great Sea. Reason for that is just because, first of all, we do see Tingle in this era, but second of all, Tingle's balloon fight starts out in the water. So, or above the water. So there is lots of water in this game, you know, kind of like a great ocean, wouldn't you say? Or a great sea. So that's my best guess, best I can do with Tingle's balloon fight, since there is like no story at all and no clues I could find as to what era this takes place in. That's my best. Next up, let's start fleshing out the this whole Link to the Past era, the era of light and dark. Now, once again, we do see that, according to Hyrule Historia and the Zelda Encyclopedia, these 4 games are all the same Link. This is the same era. So Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, that much is already confirmed. These 2 are established by Zelda Encyclopedia to be part of that same era with that same Link. So this is already a pretty fleshed out era. Like, not many Links have 4 games about them, but we're gonna flesh it out even more. So we've got this weird comic. I don't have the cover for it, but this is just a panel from it. I have read it. It's weird. It's called like Super Mario in die Nacht des Grüns. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a German-only comic published in a Club Nintendo magazine, I believe. And it's a Mario comic. But the premise is that Mario and Link and Kirby all live together in an apartment building, and they, you know, they have to stop Wario from making a pact with the devil. It's sort of like a weird horror-themed game, and you know, Mario and Link and Kirby have to you know, take on the armor and weapons of Van Helsing to stop these guys. It's a weird thing. It's a weird story, but we're gonna place it. So basically, the Link in the comic, from what we have to go on, appears to be the same Link from Link to the Past, and that's really the only clue we have. That's it. And I don't really have a whole lot to go on beyond that. Now, I'm going to say this takes place after Link to the Past, because Link to the Past is basically Link's origin story. Link's Awakening is when Link starts traveling the world. He eventually comes back to Hyrule, but then gets sucked into other countries, Holodrum and Labrina, in these other games. This could really take place anytime. It could take place after Link's Awakening, but before the Oracle of Seasons games. It could take place after the Oracle games. I'm going to say it takes place after Link's Awakening, but before Oracle of Seasons. Once again, that's a guess. We don't really know, but it would make sense because this was published around that general era, and it would make sense that when Link is, coming home to Hyrule after Link's Awakening, he gets stuck in these other adventures. So let's make some room. Next up, we got The Legend of Zelda Ancient Stone Tablets. This is a Japan-only game that was released only for the broadcast satellite system, and it basically was a clone of The Link to the Past in terms of gameplay, with, a lot of spins on it. Like, it's the same world, it revisits the same dungeons, kind of like A Link Between Worlds, only with the way... Well, I won't re-explain the broadcast satellite system. Basically, it was a satellite where you could play the game for half an hour every day. For our purposes today, Zelda Ancient Stone Tablets does have its own story, and it does take place after A Link to the Past, but it doesn't have Link in it. Link's just not there. But Zelda is there, and she, the hero you play as, he's sometimes called mascot or just player. And you can even, in the game, you can pick between a boy and a girl. It doesn't matter. It's supposed to be the same character, whichever it is. So, this character is a new hero. And it's said that this takes place not too long after A Link to the Past. Zelda's still alive. She remembers Link, but Link is just gone from the land. So, this new hero has to defeat Ganon when Ganon returns because Link is away. So it would make sense that this takes place after Link's Awakening, or around the time of Link's Awakening, because Link is gone, and that's one of the main places Link went away while Zelda stayed in Hyrule was in Link's Awakening when he went to the island of Koholint. So let's make some more space. Let's move this stuff over. We're gonna see at the end of this which era gets the most stories taking place in it. The most, which is the most Zelda-iest era ever? Which one has the most Zelda adventures happening in it? I'm gonna say this one happens, around the same time as, Link is away in Link's Awakening, and also, that Mario comic. It's this general period of Link being away from Hyrule before he returns. Next up, we've got Soul Calibur 2. Now, Soul Calibur 2 is a fighting game, but it does, in the GameCube version of it, Link does make an appearance. You can play as him, you can play in some Hyrule stages, and Link does have a backstory in the game. In the game, Link is an adult, and Hyrule is at peace, but Hyrule comes under a new threat due to this, Soul Edge blade that exists in the Soul Calibur series, and that is leading to problems in Hyrule. So Link goes to, travels through a portal to another world to basically stop it. Now, for our purposes today, basically, in this game, this does seem to be the same Link as Ocarina of Time, just judging by the art style, judging by his items, judging by, just all sorts of characteristics of him. This is Ocarina of Time Link. However, it is a little bit weird because he's an adult and Hyrule is at peace. Now, the only time Link is an adult in Ocarina of Time is in the adult timeline, right? He pulls the Master Sword, he becomes an adult, and all that stuff happens. And once he defeats Ganondorf at the end of Ocarina of Time, he's sent back in time to when he was a kid, and that starts the child timeline. But during that whole time he was an adult, Hyrule was never at peace. So Soul Calibur 2 can't take place here in the adult timeline. Which means the only other place where Ocarina of Time Link grows up to be an adult is here, in the child timeline. So that means this has to take place here in the child timeline, but just many years after Majora's Mask, because it has to have been 7 years for Link to grow up. So let's make some more room. Next up, we have The Legend of Zelda Oath of Lilto, and this is a manga series. It is once again Japan only, but this is an interesting series because this is probably the only Zelda material that creates its own hero who's not Link. He's not Link at all. He's not an incarnation of Link. unlike the Skyward Sword comic, it's not just like a new Link that's created for the comic. This is a completely new hero that's just set in the Zelda universe. He's sort of a legacy hero trying to live up to the legacy of Link, and this takes place 100 years after Link died. Now this Link, the Link that died 100 years before the events of the comic, is the same Link from Link to the Past. We know that because in this manga, the backstory of the manga describes exactly what happened in A Link to the Past. It mentions Aghanim, who is only ever in Link to the Past. So definitely it's the same Link from Link to the Past. This takes place like 100 years after Link is dead. So that means that this is a new era. This is not part of the era of Light and Dark. It's its own era. So let's give it its own era box. I'll call this the era of Lilto, because I have nothing better to call it. Once again, this was a series of 4 mangas. And it sits by itself comfortably in its own era. Just that, I mean, this image I'm just using to stand in for the entire series because they all continue one after another. It's a series. Let's look at this manga story. This is just called Original Side Story. It doesn't have a full title. This is a extra story included in the Majora's Mask manga, but it is separate from the manga. It is its own story with its own title and all that stuff. This is a story about the origin of Majora's Mask, how the mask itself was created. Now, we don't really have much context for this except that it was a very, very long time ago, which means it is a very, very long time before the events of Majora's Mask. Now, that could place it anywhere here in the original timeline before the timeline split. We don't know exactly where, but based on this era, the way it's depicted, it does feel like sort of a land before time almost. So I guess I'm just gonna have to guess that this does take place at the beginning of the timeline. I'm just gonna put it all the way here, even before the era of the goddess Hylia. Let's stretch this out a bit, and let's give this its own box. We're gonna call this the era of Majora, because that's how Majora's Mask came from. Next up, we got The Legend of Zelda: Molblin's Magic Spear. Now, this is a children's book. It's a picture book. It was released in the 80s in America, and it is based on the original The Legend of Zelda. So this is a very, very classic book. And this book just seems to take place during The Legend of Zelda. It's just a random adventure that Link had during his adventures throughout the game of The Legend of Zelda, where he runs into this moblin that has a powerful magic spear and he doesn't know how to deal with it. But yeah, it's just a quick story. So there's not a whole lot of lore buried in here. It's just a quick, oh, how do I deal with this moblin? And all the artwork, all the clues indicate that it is set during The Legend of Zelda. So let's put it right there, right next to The Legend of Zelda. I'm putting it between The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link, just because, you know, it does take place during The Legend of Zelda, and so yeah. And here we go, folks. The one you've all been waiting for. The Legend of Zelda, the animated series, the cartoon from the 80s, the classic. Excuse me, princess. Yes. And don't tell me that you're going to consider this non-canon. I don't care. We're not considering canon today. We're totally disregarding that. Everything that's officially licensed in Zelda counts. So this TV series absolutely counts for our list today. It is part of the Zelda franchise. It is part of the Zelda history and lore. So we are going to count it in here in this timeline. Now, when does this take place? Well, clearly the Legend of Zelda TV series was made around the era of the first 2 Zelda games, the Legend of Zelda and the Adventure of Link. But does that necessarily mean it takes place around them, though? Well, the clues in the series do seem to back that up, because first of all, the series alludes to the events of, The Legend of Zelda, in that Link used to be an adventurer. He used to be wandering around Hyrule and trying to beat Ganon, but now he's, sort of retired into Hyrule Castle at the start of the series. So this does take place after that. I'm thinking it also takes place after the adventure of Link, because Ganon is alive again, right? Ganon is killed by Link at the end of The Legend of Zelda, so it has to take place after The Legend of Zelda, but Ganon is still dead up until the adventure of Link, and, beyond it. So, if Ganon returns, it has to be sometime after the adventure of Link. It can't be during The Legend of Zelda, because in this TV series, they have the Triforce of Wisdom, and Link and Zelda team up to protect the Triforce of Wisdom, so it can't be during The Legend of Zelda, because Link gets all the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and puts them back together at the end of this game. Can't be after The Legend of Zelda, so it just has to be after the adventure of Link. That's the only place to put it. And indeed, the Zelda comic series is going to tie into this and explain more what happened after the adventure of Link. It is going to sort of confirm this timeline placement. So I am going to have to put it here after the Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. This goes at the end of the era of decline so far, but as we'll see, this era is about to get a little bit bigger. Next up, we got the Legend of Zelda Valiant comic series. And this was a series, an American comic series, which was once again made in the 80s. So this was made around the time of the Zelda Cartoon series. And while the art style, it isn't identical to the cartoon series, but it does sort of flesh out the events from the games, the Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, as well as the cartoon series itself. So it does... It ties into it neatly. And so it was actually kind of cool that back in the 80s, we were sort of seeing the birth of a real expanded universe, because you're seeing, the cartoons and the comics and other media we're going to see later all tying in to make, sort of one big universe. And that was just sort of like starting to grow. It's almost sort of unfortunate that A Link to the Past came out, because A Link to the Past is sort of, it's part of the same timeline, but it's sort of a reboot. It takes place way earlier in the timeline, so it's sort of like this whole expanded universe they were building just was kind of abandoned, which is the unfortunate side effect. But it was a cool period when they were just starting to build this sort of expanded universe from scratch. But anyway, for our purposes today, this comic series is taking place generally in the same era as the Zelda Cartoon series. This is confirmed by the comic itself, because the comic itself starts with the first issue of this series starts with a backstory, which retells the events of The Legend of Zelda, the events of the adventure of Link, and it sort of alludes to the adventure to the cartoon series as well. Plus, we even see characters from the cartoon reappear, like the fairy sprite. So I'm gonna say this takes place around the time of the animated series, and probably, maybe a little bit after it, because we do see Zelda take on a new, outfit. She becomes more of a fighter in her own right in this series than she was in the animated series. So I'm gonna say this takes place a little bit after the Zelda animated series. Next up, we got these two CDI Zelda games. These are Zelda games made for the Philips CDI system. The first one is called Link: The Faces of Evil. The second one is called Zelda: The Wand of Gamelon. Now, I'm pretty sure Zelda: The Wand of Gamelon is actually the first Zelda game, even if it's not an official part of the official Zelda series. It is the first Zelda video game that I'm aware of in which you actually play as Zelda herself, so that's sort of a historical milestone. But in terms of timeline placement, silly as they are, I know you guys are gonna meme about that in the comments, but yes, they are Zelda, so we are gonna place them in the timeline. And once again, these two games seem to fit in to the, sort of world building they were doing in the Legend of Zelda animated series and the Legend of Zelda comic series. So the way the characters act in the game, like Link asking Zelda for a kiss, that is a hallmark of Zelda the animated series, the fact that they live in a castle with the king, and Link saying, gee, it sure is boring. You know, that all makes it seem very, very clearly intended to be part of the same era as the Legend of Zelda animated series. So, but, I mean, there aren't a whole lot more clues than that, except once again, Ganon is still back. So it probably takes place generally during this same era as the Zelda animated series and the Zelda comics. I'm going to say maybe it's around the same time, probably, you know, after, but it's hard to really tell. But just generally around the same time as the Zelda animated series and the Zelda comics. Next up, we have the Nintendo Adventure Books series. This is an American, sort of like a choose-your-own-adventure game book series. Basically, like, you would be reading it like a book, but then you come to a choice. Like, it's like, if you want to do this, turn to page 22. If you want to do the other thing, turn to page 35, that sort of thing. This game also includes lots of little puzzles for you to solve, and it's pretty fantastic. Additionally, it is also a game where you play as Zelda. At least the first book is. The first book, The Crystal Trap, you play as Zelda. This Nintendo Adventure Book series has a lot of books. Most of them are about Mario. There's 2 about Zelda, and the first one you play as Zelda, which is this one. The second one you play as Link. Now, in preparing for this video, I actually read this book. I found it online. It is pretty amazing. I will say it. I was engaged the whole time. I am glad I took the time and read this. But once again, this does tie in with, you know, this whole era of Zelda, you know, storytelling that they were building up. This is set during the era of, you know, all these other Zelda stories. The art style of Zelda, the way she's drawn, it's her outfit from the Zelda Valiant comic series. So it's probably around the same time as that. Ganon is still back, so there's that. They don't defeat him or anything during these books. So, I mean, it's probably just around the same time as the Zelda CDI games. I could be wrong about the exact placement, but it is generally in this vicinity for sure. So we're certainly seeing a lot of growth in this era of The Legend of Zelda. This is shaping up to be quite a formidable candidate. You know, is this era, the era of decline, is this going to be like the biggest Zelda era ever? We've also got this Zelda Game & Watch game. Now, this really just doesn't have any story, but the art does indicate, you know, it is intended to be, you know, the same Link as from The Legend of Zelda. You know, this was before the whole concept of other Links had been introduced, so it seems pretty straightforward that this was intended to be the same Link, and it's probably... Once again, this game just doesn't have a story, so I'm just going to place it, you know, sometime generally during this era, because, you know, once again, they have to rescue the Triforce, which could be a plot of an episode of the Zelda animated series. It's generally in this vicinity. The Zelda Game Watch, which, yes, is different than the Zelda Game & Watch. Once again, it has no story, so I'm just going to have to throw it in with that same era. Just based on the art style, I have no choice but to count it in with the era of decline, with the original Legend of Zelda, you know, saga. But if you thought this era was done, oh no, it just keeps growing and growing. Because, you know, as much American media as we've seen set in the Zelda franchise, we've also got this book over here. This is another game book, but this one is Japan only. Unfortunately, that means there are not really any translations available for it that I could find online anyway, which is unfortunate because this cover looks really cool. I'm really digging the art style, like like it being set at night with the stars out. It kind of has this sort of mysterious, surreal kind of vibe. I'm really liking their use of color. It feels very like high fantasy to me, which is so yeah. I really would like to explore this book, and it's got some really cool illustrations throughout it. But the only thing I could get is that the basic story of this book does mention the backstory of The Legend of Zelda, and the game starts at a time of peace after The Legend of Zelda happens, and Ganon is just gone. He is defeated. So there's a couple of possibilities here, right? Because Ganon is gone, that means that this could take place between Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. But because, we know Ganon was dead, was killed at the end of Legend of Zelda. He was brought back after the Adventure of Link, like not even in that game, after that game, sometime between the Adventure of Link and Legend of Zelda, Ganon comes back. So you could either place it after Zelda 2, but before the Zelda animated series. That's a valid possibility. Or you could place it after all of this stuff, because, eventually Ganon is going to be defeated again, but yeah, it's really just hard to be sure. I'm going to leave this one on the side for now until maybe something else can give us some more clues. Next up, we got Captain N, the Game Masters. Now, this was another animated series. This series is not based on The Legend of Zelda. The premise is that it's this guy, Captain N, who's basically, just a video game player, a guy who plays video games from the real world, but somehow he gets sucked into his TV and he ends up in the world of video games, and he can go back and forth between different video game universes. And so in different episodes of Captain N, he meets different characters like Donkey Kong, Mario, and so on and so forth. Now, there are a few episodes in this series where we meet Link and Zelda, and this does seem to be the same Link and Zelda that we saw in the Legend of Zelda animated series. However, they are depicted as a lot more mature than they were in that series. It's the same general character, but they do seem more grown up, their personalities are more mature, and also Ganon has been defeated for a long time. So that indicates to me this is quite a while. This is probably years after the Zelda animated series, years after the CDI games and the adventure books and just all this stuff. We're going to put this at the end of the era of decline, but I think this could provide some clues as to when this game book might take place, because this takes place after Ganon has been defeated again, and during the events of Captain N, his followers revive him with a potion of power. This takes place in an era of peace after Ganon has been defeated for a while. So it would make a lot of sense for this to take place here, in between, this whole era of Link and Zelda fighting Ganon, and here, the era where Ganon is revived. So Ganon is defeated, then you get this book, then you get him being revived again in Captain N, the Game Masters. Next up, you've got Zelda's Adventure. This is another one of the CDI games, but this is a very different style from the first two CDI games. And once again, Zelda does seem a little bit more mature than, she was in the previous games. This seems like an older incarnation of Zelda. So probably that it would make sense for Zelda's Adventure to take place in this whole time period around the time of Captain and the Game Masters, when Link and Zelda are more mature than they were in the previous games. All right, next up we got Link's Crossbow Training. That's right, the game no one ever wants to deal with, and people make jokes about putting on the timeline, but never actually do. I'm going to put it on the timeline. That's right. You want to fight about it? Try and stop me. So, yeah, this one's pretty easy. Actually, this is just like the Link from Twilight Princess, and he's practicing with a crossbow in the same areas that the game takes place in. So, I think it's pretty clear that this game takes place right after Twilight Princess, in the era of Twilight. Yeah, there you go. Not a whole lot to say there. I mean, Link's Crossbow Training just doesn't have a whole lot of story to it. It is just, Link practicing with a crossbow. That's really all it is. I played through the game. It's a really fun game, but, it's a mini game. Not a ton of story there, but it is a part of the Zelda universe and pseudo-canon, so I am including it in here as well, and, we have a placement for it. Our timeline's getting a bit hefty. It's getting a bit hefty. Next up, we got BS The Legend of Zelda. BS The Legend of Zelda is basically a remake of the original Legend of Zelda, but, once again, just like the other BS Zelda game, BS Zelda The Ancient Stone Tablets, BS Zelda is basically a remake of The Legend of Zelda, and it has a very similar world to The Legend of Zelda, but it's different. It's different enough that it really feels like mostly a different game, or at least somewhat a different game. It does not include Link. Instead, you play as that BS Satellite mascot, who I'm just going to call Mascot, the same guy from the other BS Zelda game. Now, the backstory here does indicate that it takes place sometime after the Imprisoning War. Now, the Imprisoning War is an event that happens basically at the beginning of the Downfall timeline. It's like what happens in Ocarina of Time if Link isn't around to stop it. So, the Imprisoning War starts the Downfall timeline, and after the Imprisoning War is over and Ganon is sealed, there's an era of peace, and then the events of BS The Legend of Zelda take place. That's what the backstory of this game tells us. Now, we don't really know what that means. We could put this right here at the beginning of the Downfall timeline before A Link to the Past, but that doesn't really seem to make sense from the state of the world in this game. In this game, Hyrule is destroyed. It's a wreck. It's like there aren't any towns or villages left, just like in the original The Legend of Zelda. So, it could just be that the backstory told to us in the game, is true, but it's omitting stuff. It's like, yeah, the Imprisoning War happened, then there was an era of peace. It might be leaving out that there were other adventures in between. So, I do think this takes place in its own era because, there's no reference to, Zelda knowing Link or, nothing like that. This does seem like it's its own era, but it's probably around, it seems like it's generally around the time of The Legend of Zelda. I don't think it's, you could put it before or after The Legend of Zelda. I think that would be fair. I'm going to put it after this whole Legend of Zelda era because, I don't know, like, it was made after. It feels like it's a resurgence of the same thing happening again. This is just, once again, it's just a guess. It's just me doing my best. Once again, I will redo this timeline if I get new clues. But for now, let's head over here and put it in its own era after, we'll call this the BS era, and we will put BS The Legend of Zelda in this era, making it the last thing in the Downfall timeline. Next up, we've got The Legend of Zelda Battle Quest, and this time there just really aren't any clues at all. Once again, this is a game with no story. It's included in the Nintendo Land game for the Wii U. So yeah, I don't really know where this takes place. The best thing I have is that it involves, multiple different colored Links playing together, kind of like the Four Swords games, which, doesn't really mean anything because the original Four Swords takes place, in the original timeline before the timeline split, and after the Minish Cap. This could take place then. I have a feeling it takes place after Four Swords Adventures. I really don't have, much to go on for that, but it was made after it. It's another Four Swords-y kind of game, and so, and you do have to defeat Ganon again. So yeah, I'm just gonna put it here. I do think it's its own era, so let's just put this over here. We'll call this the Battle era. We'll color it red because it's, it's all battle-y. Next up, we got Hyrule Warriors. Now, this is an interesting game. This is a Wii U game. It features a new Link and a new Zelda. At the beginning of the game, Link and Zelda are meeting each other for the first time, so this is not any other Link or Zelda we know. This is its own era, but where? When? When does this take place? Which timeline are we going to put this on? Well, there are actually some strong clues on where to place it. Now, in this game, you open up portals to the past and you team up with heroes that come from those past eras. Now, the past eras that you open up portals to are the era of the Twilight era, where you open up portal to during the events of Twilight Princess, the era of the Hero of Time, which is Ocarina of Time, and the era of Skyward Sword, which is the Sky era. So it would seem that this game takes place after all of those games, which would put it here in the child timeline at sometime after Twilight Princess. However, some people, would object, hey, in some of the DLC for this game for Hyrule Warriors, which you can also play in Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition, there's like a portal is open to the Wind Waker as well, right? So that could confuse things because the Wind Waker, of course, is here in the adult timeline. So if portals could be open to 2 different eras and 2 different timelines, then that sort of blows the idea of this being in the child timeline out of the sky. See, I actually replayed Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition for this video, and I think I got a pretty definitive answer here. This is one of the cases where you are going to get a very clear and definitive answer. Because first of all, the issue with the portals with the Wind Waker is treated differently than the other portals. Earlier in the game, when it talks about portals, it's talking about portals to past eras. When characters from Hyrule Warriors go into these eras, the narration says things that indicate like they know this era, like, oh, this is how it was in the Twilight era, or she marveled at what it looked like in the era of the Hero of Time. So these characters know these eras like it's their past. Furthermore, in one stage in the game, in a rose garden, there's statues of heroes from past eras, and one of them is the Twilight Princess Wolf Link. So that clearly indicates this takes place in the Twilight era. Now, what about the portal to the Wind Waker? Well, when those portals are open, when the whole Wind Waker storyline is introduced, that's discussed as a portal to another world. The characters from the game, when they go into the world of the Wind Waker, they don't talk about it as a past era. They talk about it as a strange world. None of them show familiarity for the Great Sea or show any understanding of what's going on in the events of this game. That makes it pretty definitive. This is not part of the adult timeline. The events of the Wind Waker are not past events for the characters in Hyrule Warriors, which puts this in the child timeline, and it is its own era. Now, where am I going to place it here? Now, definitely we know it's after Twilight Princess. Is it also after Four Swords Adventures? I'm going to say yes. The reason for that is at the beginning of Hyrule Warriors, it's established that Ganon's spirit was broken into 4 pieces, and those pieces were hidden in different eras, okay? Now, at the end of Four Swords Adventures, Ganon's spirit was sealed inside the Four Sword, and it was just laid to rest. Now, the Four Sword, as we know, breaks into 4 pieces, or it splits into 4 pieces, so it makes a lot of sense if any Link before Hyrule Warriors wants to split Link into 4 different pieces, it makes sense for it to be the Link from Four Swords Adventures. So I'm going to go right ahead and say this does take place in the child timeline, but after the events of Four Swords Adventures. I'm going to also say it takes place after Battle Quest, because this seems like it takes place a very, very long time after Four Swords Adventures, and we'll give it its own era. I'll just call it the Hyrule Warriors era. Let's space these out a bit so, they can breathe a bit. They're not like right one after another. There's time passing in between these eras, right? Next up, we've got Cadence of Hyrule. Now, this one was tricky. I had trouble with this one. Now, Cadence of Hyrule does not give us much in the way of backstory. We really just don't know. So, however, the developers did say in an interview that they did think about when and where this takes place in the Zelda timeline, even though the game isn't considered canon, yada yada yada, that doesn't matter for our purposes. They did have an idea of where this takes place in the timeline. That's the important thing. But where? Well, one clue is that this is a reborn Ganondorf. The Ganondorf in this game does not show memory of being, Ganondorf before, and the Gerudo don't remember him as the Ganondorf who's been coming back again and again and again. Now, throughout the Zelda timeline, the idea has been that, Link and Zelda are reincarnated many times, but there's only one Ganon. It's the same guy who first appears in Ocarina of Time, and then in all 3 timelines, Ganon continues to exist for many hundreds of years, and thousands of years, and so on and so forth. There's only one of him, right? Now, that is actually no longer the case in the child timeline. In the child timeline, Ganondorf is defeated in Twilight Princess pretty definitively. He's killed. He's dead. Now, of course, he can always, resurrect from that. That's been known to happen before. But in Four Swords Adventures, which is one of our canon Zelda games or whatever, we see that Ganondorf has not been reborn. He has instead reincarnated. It's a totally new Ganondorf, one who doesn't know his origins anymore. So that establishes that the cycle has been broken, probably by Twilight Princess. Ganondorf that we know is no more. So after the cycle being broken, there's room for new Ganons to appear, and that means that it's very likely that Cadence of Hyrule takes place in this timeline, in the child timeline, sometime a long time after all of this nonsense. So I'll give this one its own era. I'll call it the Cadence era. Now, the one thing left to deal with is this whole Breath of the Wild era. I've assumed that Breath of the Wild is in a merged timeline. It takes place after all the games in all the other timelines. They haven't specified that officially, but, I mean, that seems to be... Look, that's what I'm going with. Now, there's only one last thing to place, and that is Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Age of Calamity, we know it is related to Breath of the Wild somehow. It takes place somewhat about 100 years before it, to be exact. But Hyrule Warriors, while it does take place in the same era as Breath of the Wild, sort of, because it's within the same lifespan of Link, it's the same Link in Hyrule Warriors as it is in Breath of the Wild, but it's a separate timeline. So we are actually going to have to create a whole new timeline. It is established that Hyrule Warriors takes place in a new timeline because the actions of Terrako, the guardian from the future, going back in time and changing history in that game. So that's why Hyrule Warriors is not actually the backstory to Breath of the Wild. It starts out that way, but then history shifts onto a new path, creating a new timeline. So we have yet another branching timeline after the original 3 timelines merged. The Zelda timeline is overall richer and deeper and more interesting than we thought it was when we started this, because there's so many more stories that people just don't talk about and get overlooked, but they are part of Zelda. They're part of the Zelda franchise. But all the Zelda theorists, they just kind of say, oh, it's not canon, it doesn't count. Yeah, but it also does count, in a way. I mean, I guess it depends what you count as, but if you do count these things, it makes a more interesting timeline that's more fun to play with. That is all I'm saying, and that's all I've got to show you for right now. I'll include a full image of this timeline that you can download. Link will be in the description below, and that's all I've got to show you right now. But thanks so much for watching, folks, and Zelda! This is the first video on this channel, or at all, that Pat Dan Draws on YouTube, aka Yak Games, has edited the video for me. I personally think he did a great job. Please let us know in the comments if you agree, and hopefully he will be doing some more editing in future videos on this channel and on the Paper Computer Games channel as well. With all that being said, thanks so much for watching, folks.